today's webinar. The topic of discussion today is roles and responsibilities between case management and community support providers. It looks like we still have some people connecting, but we're started. This will be recorded, and so we will post this on our DHS DDD website soon after we're done here today, for reference for those who weren't able to join or want to share or revisit the topic. I do want to start by saying that the document that you see up on your screen says conflict-free case management with a blue header at the top, and then breaks down the responsibilities between case management and community support providers. This document was shared with case management agencies and CSPs last week, and so it's still circulating for feedback, and we know that there might still be comments coming in. We tried to gather what we could yesterday before we kind of finalized everything we had. If you have any further comments or feedback, you can send them to Samantha Hines or myself. And I believe, I'm not sure our contact information is in this presentation, but we can put that in the chat box. So we also have the document that we're reviewing now available for download. So I believe if you click on the little computer monitor at the bottom of your screen, you can download from there. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start with point of entry, and I'm going to turn it over to Sam. We're going to be kind of tag teaming back and forth between the different roles and what that entails.
All right, in the area of point of entry, the case manager is going to be responsible for receiving any new referrals and submitting funding requests to the Division of Developmental Disabilities. Part of that process also entails completing and submitting to the Department of Social Services the DSS 240 or the 265, and that will be submitted to the benefit specialist in the area where the CSP is located, and that needs to be one of the first things that's completed. It does impact how quickly we're able to process level of cares. In addition, the case manager will collect all of the information for the level of care and submit it to the division. Here at the division, the program specialist for the community support provider will be the one to actually complete the level of care. The case manager is responsible for getting to know the person supported and identify and coordinate any of the supports that are needed, and then assist the participant in completing applications to community support providers if that hasn't already been completed. And then the last thing is the case manager will administer the ICAP. I also wanted to point out that these point of entry responsibilities are different when a person is transitioning out of an institutional setting such as SDDC, HSC, or a nursing home. And there's a separate SDDC manual that goes over what those different processes are. So I would make sure that you follow those instructions when you're helping someone transition out of an institutional facility.
Okay, the role of the community support provider at the point of entry, where typically families and participants might be coming directly to a CSP to learn more about services. At that point of entry, the CSP's role is really, if that's the first conversation a person or their family has had with our system, they should be referring to a case management organization and giving them the information for the case management agencies available within that region. So they can provide a packet of information about the supports that the CSP provides, as well as those case management providers. In the event that the person has a case manager who is helping them apply for direct services, really the CSP's role is just as usual to be reviewing those applications and going through the typical admissions process. And facilitating those tours, looking at staff matching, and really honing in on what the person is needing and wanting versus the availability at the CSP.
Okay. In the area of ISP development, the case manager is responsible for conducting and coordinating all of the assessments that have been determined warranted by the ISP team. They will administer the ICAP annually with input from the rest of the ISP team. They will utilize person-centered planning approaches for the discovery section. This may be compiled in the personal focus worksheet. That might be where you find all of the information that happens during that discovery process. The case manager will also facilitate the pre-meeting if necessary. Will complete all of the ISP documents. That's the personal focus worksheet, the ISP agenda. They'll do that prior to the actual ISP. They will work with the participant and the rest of the ISP team to schedule a meeting and then invite all of the team members. You'll facilitate the meeting, complete the ISP agenda and the ISP and TheraP, and then distribute to the rest of the team. You'll also review any CSP comments that may be made after the ISP is entered into the TheraP system. CSPs have the option to approve any ISP that comes through, and so the case manager is responsible for viewing all and updating the ISP based on those comments. The guide for case managers that has more detailed information about all of these areas is one of the attachments that's available for download as part of this presentation. I also wanted to clarify to everyone on the call today that the ISP isn't one single document. It's all three of the documents: the personal focus worksheet, the ISP agenda, and the ISP.
The community support provider role in the ISP development is really just sort of that collaboration, so participating in that pre-meeting if that is deemed necessary by the team, completing those assessments as deemed warranted by the team or as requested by the case manager, providing that information that's pertinent to the ICAP completion, participating in using those person-centered thinking tools, person-centered planning approaches for that discovery and assessment piece, and that's, I think most CSPs have been doing that for a very long time, not changing drastically. The participation, that active participation in the annual ISP meeting, providing that feedback and input as far as what supports are needed and wanted. Acknowledging that ISP within TheraP to indicate that agreement and acknowledgement that you've read it and agree to implement. We do have a bullet in here that if revisions to the ISP are necessary prior to the implementation, communicating those to the case manager in a timely manner. On a side note, we have talked about that 15-day implementation timeframe that's currently in ARSD, and so we will be taking that into consideration. We'll continue to take that into consideration throughout this transition time. So just wanted to mention that as well. One of the things that I want to point out is the next bullet where it talks about writing specific daily supports to be implemented by the team, including the information related to the scope, duration, frequency, documentation expectations for supports provided as outlined in the ISP. So to give an example of that, if you're participating in an ISP for Mary, and one of the desired outcomes for Mary is to earn her green belt in Taekwondo, one of the action plans outlined in that TheraP ISP document would probably include attending Taekwondo class 2 times a week, let's say. So that would be what's in the ISP. And then it would be the CSP's responsibility to really pare down what that looks like and write those supports so direct support staff can implement that. So that might include helping Mary make sure that her taekwondo uniform is clean, arranging for bus rides or providing transportation, whether she needs someone to stay with her or if she can be left alone. Some of those very specific things that DSPs need to know to provide that support in a meaningful way. So that is something that is expected of the CSP. So it's not the writing of the entire goal or the action plan, but those very specific, the word that always comes to my mind is method, and that's a pretty outdated term, but back from my DSP days, that's what the word was that we used. Also to share those written supports with the case manager for informational purposes so they can be aware of how those supports are being provided and how that's outlined. So as they're monitoring the ISP, they can determine whether or not that's provided and agreed on.
Another thing that I wanted to mention, excuse me, in ISP development is the service and support section of the ISP. This is a section in the ISP that wasn't really active until recently. Now that everyone's accounts and people supported are linked and unified within the TheraP system, it's a section that can be used to document all of the services that a person's receiving, the dates and times they're receiving that service. And it really can be used kind of as a replacement for the service record.
Does someone have a question? It sounds like there's a line unmuted. Okay, maybe not.
So that service and support section should be active now, and case managers can go in and update that information, and CSPs can go back and look at it as well to see what services are being need to be implemented and the frequency.
And the other areas, and I see that there's a question in the chat box, and I'll get to that in just a quick second. But also the CSP responsibility is obviously to implement that ISP and the related programs or methods or whatever term you might use as agreed upon by the team, and also to distribute that ISP, because we know that, well, I say we know, but that might be an overconfident term considering some of the hiccups we've had with TheraP, but we're pretty sure that the ISP and the case management account can be accessed through the CSP secondary account. But what we know is that each CSP will basically identify a few people that would be acknowledging and commenting on those ISPs. It's then the CSP's responsibility to distribute, whether that's printing, downloading as a PDF, and emailing, whatever that looks like, but getting that ISP to the team members who need to know and don't have access to the secondary TheraP account and that online ISP.
So to keep things interesting, we've got a couple poll questions throughout the presentation. And the first one is posted now if everyone just wants to take a minute to answer, and we can recap when we're done.
You happen to have a puppy or a larger dog barking in the background? Your line is unmuted. Please mute. Thanks. Yes. So, okay, so the poll question was, who writes the programs for day-to-day support such as ADLs? And it looks like the majority answered CSP, which is accurate. So for those of you who answered both, that I wouldn't say that's necessarily incorrect, because some of that probably will be discussed and included in the ISP itself through discussion records it might be included in some sort of action steps towards an outcome, but the very specific detailed supports will be written by the CSP. Okay, so we're going back to the document to cover ISP monitoring.
Okay, so a case manager is responsible for completing all components of the ISP monitoring quarterly, and this includes face-to-face observations. It's recommended that the case manager conduct the monitoring and the observation in multiple settings or locations where supports are being provided to a participant. The way the quarterly monitoring is set up in TheraP, you can document more than one observation. You just have to use the add button. The case manager should ensure the appropriate implementation of the ISP, analyze and summarize any of the data related to a person's goals, any of the day-to-day supports, restrictions and restoration plans, any behavior support plan, medical issues or appointments, and any trends in incident reports. They should also review the completed ISP monitoring with the participant and or their guardian and obtain their feedback. And then this needs to be submitted every quarter to the entire ISP team.
Okay, so the community support provider role in ISP monitoring is really to provide that qualitative and quantitative data to the case manager. So that would include progress towards goals, excuse me, progress towards any rights restrictions, restoration plans that are included in the person's plan, some of those day-to-day supports, incident reporting, medical appointments, things like that. Basically, the information that the case manager needs to review to really determine if those services are being implemented as written and agreed upon by the team, and to really be able to see if there are any trends in say, behavior incident reports or things that need further follow-up. The CSP also will certainly want to be providing input for the working, not working that's included in that ISP monitoring document. So it's really an opportunity to participate in the active revisions, the active need for revisions or potential need for revisions of the ISP. So that maintains a living, breathing document, and changes can be made in a timely manner. Making those recommendations and reviewing that completed ISP monitoring and implementing any team recommendations if there are changes identified within that. I did also want to mention, I know we're having some problems right now with the attachments and the downloads, but we are also printing some copies of the ISP guide and the ISP monitoring guide. So copies, we will be sending out copies for each case manager, and then probably at least one copy to each community support provider. We also have those documents, the updated documents, on our DDD website. So if you're not able to get them here today, you can go to our website and download it from there for those two guide documents anyway.
So we do have another poll question. What information does the CSP need to provide to the case manager so that the case manager can complete the quarterly monitoring?
It looks like all of the above is the popular answer. A+, everybody. That is absolutely right. So just as we covered, making sure that the case manager has everything they need to make sure that the plan is being implemented and follow-up occurs as often as needed. So that takes us into ISP revisions.
So ISP revisions can happen at any time during the course of the year. The case manager would be responsible for facilitating any team meetings as changes are needed or requested. The CSP, the person supported, a guardian can all request a team meeting at any point. The case manager will be responsible for documenting any of the discussion that's held and any decisions that are made at special team meetings. This is an area of our ISP guide that has recently been updated. So I would make sure to look at those sections carefully when you do get a chance to download the updated ISP guide. The case manager can make updates to the ISP and the ISP agenda through a change form. And again, there's more details about how to do that in the updated guide.
The role of the CSP and ISP revision is really, again, just that active engagement and requesting those special team meetings as warranted as issues come up, contacting the case manager to let them know that this might be a good time to pull together and revisit a topic. Active participation in those team meetings, and then if changes to the ISP are needed as a result of those team meetings, to again develop those specific strategies for implementation and share those with the case manager and the rest of the team. And that sort of goes back to the ISP development piece that we covered.
All right, we'll move on to critical incident reporting. The case manager is responsible for completing any internal incident reports if the incident occurred within case management supports. So this would include if a self-advocate or a family member reported to the case manager an allegation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. The case manager will review any incident reports completed by the CSP, identify any critical incident reports, and report to the division. If there are allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation against a case manager or someone else within a case management organization, the case management organization would be responsible for doing an investigation of that incident. The case manager is responsible also for reporting any of those allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation to Adult Services and Aging. And they are also responsible for following up on critical incidents and facilitating changes to a person's ISP if needed, and ensure follow-up by the organization as needed as well.
Okay, so the inverse of that essentially is for CSPs to be completing those internal incident reports as has always happened, identifying the CIRs and reporting to DDD as has been common practice, investigating the A&E reports. So again, the inverse of what Sam was talking about. If the incident happened within that case management organization and was reported to a case management agency staff, then the CSP is not responsible to investigate that. Again, you're following up on those CIRs and participating in requesting changes to the plan if they're needed, such as preventative measures. So that not a lot changes for CIR reporting for community support providers, just sort of the specific situations where an incident might be alleged against or happen within case management services, and that is not the CSP's responsibility to investigate or follow up on. And we have another poll question.
When a CIR is observed by the case manager, who is responsible for making the verbal and written report to DDD? So it looks like a majority of people have said that the case manager would be responsible for making that report, and that would be correct. Again, if an incident is observed by the case manager or happens within case management services, they are the ones who are responsible for doing both the written and the verbal report to DDD. All right, moving along to Human Rights Committee and Behavior Intervention Committee. The case manager can participate in the HRC and BIC meetings as needed or available. The case manager should also update the annual ISP to include any information regarding rights restrictions and behavior support plans. This can be documented in a couple different areas of the ISP, in the risk section as well as in the required items of the ISP agenda. The ISP team approval for highly restrictive procedures and rights restrictions on an ongoing basis will be organized by the case manager and documented in the ISP and in quarterly monitoring. So this is different than the actual Human Rights Committee approval. This is the person's ISP team, the people that they might work with on a day-to-day basis, their parent or guardian. So not to be confused with Human Rights Committee approval.
Again, the community support provider role in human rights and behavior intervention committees is that the CSP is responsible for the composition and training of those committees. The meetings are typically facilitated by a chair at the CSP. Writing those plans and ensuring that they receive due process in a timely manner according to ARSD. Ensuring the approval of any highly restrictive procedures, rights restrictions, restoration plans prior to implementation. The CSP is responsible to implement those plans as approved, and also if the committees would happen to disapprove or make recommendations, then the CSP is also responsible to revise those and come back to the committee with those recommendations included. And then submit those HRC and BIC approvals and the behavior support plans to the case manager as being a pretty key part of services. Typically, if a person has a behavior support plan and or rights restrictions, that typically has a pretty big impact on their life, and so it's important for the case manager to be aware of what those entail, as well as the progress towards or any barriers because of those. So that, yeah.
Okay, so emergency rights restrictions. This is going to follow a lot of the same information that's in the Human Rights Committee and Behavior Intervention Committee section. A case manager, though, it's possible that an emergency rights restriction would have to be implemented by a case manager, and they would need to follow the CIR reporting guidelines for any emergency restriction, and as well as report that information to the Human Rights Committee at the CSP. The case manager also needs to document any emergency rights restrictions in the quarterly monitoring and facilitate any team discussion if necessary. For instance, if an emergency rights restriction is going to become a permanent part, if a physical restraint, for instance, that was an emergency rights restriction is going to become a part of someone's ongoing plan, the case manager would need to be part of that discussion and update the ISP as necessary.
Again, if the CSP implements an emergency restriction, the CSP is following those CIR reporting guidelines as well as making that report to HRC. The CSP is also responsible to notify the case manager regarding implementation of those emergency procedures and follow up as needed. So just, again, providing that information and keeping the case manager in the loop about what's going on. So sorry, I was just going to point out there is a question in the chat pod. I'm not sure. I just wanted to kind of say out loud, I'm drafting a response, but it's hard to talk and type, at least for me anyway. There's a question about who is responsible for making changes if HRC BIC does not approve, supports, restrictions, or behavior support plans. That is the CSP's responsibility. They are writing those plans, taking them to committees for approval and implementing them. The case manager is really at kind of a monitoring level when it comes to those. So the CSP is responsible.
We're getting a little bit of feedback, so if everyone could just make sure their phone is muted.
Oh yes, that's better. Okay, thank you.
All right, so we wanted to open up for discussion, and you can either unmute or chat in the chat box. But with emergency rights restrictions and the case manager having to report those to the Human Rights Committee of the CSP so that it can go through due process, we wanted to get feedback from CSPs in particular about who a case manager should report an emergency rights restriction that happens on their watch. Is there one central person within the CSP who would get that information?
You can unmute and respond, or you can respond in the chat pod. Okay, so Shanna is saying that for VOA, that would be the ISS or ISS supervisor.
Julie, this is Deb at Northern Hills. What we would do is have them contact the internal support coordinator, who would then report it to the person who is in charge of the HRC BIC committee.
Okay, is that pretty consistent across the board? We weren't sure if it would differ between CSPs depending on how the personnel is set up, or if it would be kind of that internal service coordinator type person. Okay, and so Carla at Valiant Living is saying that that would be the Director of Quality Assurance. Black Hills Works is saying the person's internal service coordinator. So what might be helpful, and like I mentioned at the beginning, this was circulated for feedback. What we would like to what I would like to know is if folks could email Sam and I with just kind of who you would expect. If it's the same across the board, we can include that and update this document accordingly. If it's different across the board, then we can just make a note that the case manager needs to be familiar with each CSP's contact person or something more generic like that. So, okay, thank you.
All right, so moving on to significant change requests. The case manager is the one who will submit all significant change requests to the division. All team members must agree to the changes prior to the implementation of the changes. A case manager can initiate a change based on team meetings and things of that nature. The case manager will also be responsible for updating that services and support section that I had mentioned during ISP development. This looks very similar to, or can act very similarly to, the service record that we were using in Launchpad, because it's a way to document all of the services that a person is receiving. So if a significant change request is submitted, the case manager should go into the ISP and make sure that the information in the services and support section matches the changes that are being made on the significant change request.
For the CSP's role in significant changes, this is really making sure that all team members agree to the changes prior to implementation. So this is very different from, the process that we had, less than a year ago, but making sure that everyone agrees and that you know which changes are going to be made. The CSP can then contact the case manager, either by completing the SCR form with the changes to be made and indicating the participant guardian agreement and signing with CSP agreement, or by asking the case manager, providing them all the information they need, including the funding source, if there is a change in hours, the previous residential address, all those details would need to be provided to the case manager if that form is not completed by the CSP. Also, just to point out that the changes should not be made, the change in services should not be made until the SCR is approved by the team and everyone's in agreement. That doesn't mean that the paperwork has to be back from our office, but everyone has to be on board before a change in hours or a residential move, for example, are made. I did want to mention that that SCR form should not be submitted, and I think Sam just said this as well, should not be submitted by the CSP to the division.
All right, so we have another poll question, so everyone could take a few minutes. The question is, who can initiate a significant change request? Okay, looks like a majority of people have responded that all of the above can initiate a significant change request. Case managers can initiate them based on team meetings. Case managers can initiate them. Self-advocates who want to make changes in services make that request through a case manager, and guardians can do the same.
We do have a question in the chat pod about what needs to be done if changes are happening and SCRs are not being submitted and SAMs are not notified or included in changes. That is a really good question that I think would probably, if something specific has occurred, then that might be something that you would want to talk with the division about. If you've already reached out to the CSP and had some conversation, we would want you to problem solve on that individual case first. But if you can't meet resolution, I suppose, then we might be able to provide some guidance for you as a case manager and as well as for the CSP.
Yeah, I would just emphasize also collaboration. I know that's the word that our office has said a lot. This really is an opportunity for the teams to get together, including self-advocates and guardians, to make sure that changes are being implemented in a person-centered way. So I would really encourage the collaboration between all of the team members.
There's another question in the chat pod regarding who receives the approved SCR from the division. Hello? Okay.
Can everybody still hear us?
Yep.
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 Okay. Okay. I was like, what happened? But I just pushed mute. Okay. Okay, lots of yeses. Everybody can hear us. Okay, so that really scared me. So the question was, who receives the approved SCR from the division? The answer is that the SCR is returned to the case manager and the CSP. And typically, I think that we've identified main contacts at each case management agency. So as a case manager, now that I'm looking at the question, as a case manager, if you're not receiving that specifically back, it's probably going to like a contact person, maybe your supervisor within the case management agency. Okay. Whew. scared me.
All right, finances. The case manager is responsible for completing all of the annual eligibility forms that go to the Department of Social Services. The case manager is also responsible for documenting the financial status in the ISP. That is one of the required items under the ISP agenda. It's where the rep payee information and how often the guardian will receive financial information. The ISP agenda is where all of that will be documented.
And so the CSP responsibility will, if the CSP is the representative payee for Social Security benefits, then the CSP will be reporting the financial status annually, or whatever frequency is determined by SSA, sending that information to the conservator, Social Security Administration, etc. Also maintaining those financial records. If again the finances are managed by the CSP, and then sending those to the participant guardian as outlined in that ISP, which is the frequency that Sam just referenced. Making that financial information available to the case manager when requested for benefits management purposes. And the CSP will be assisting to, for those, the SNAP benefits, energy assistance, etc., the things that person will be accessing from day to day for their monthly or weekly expenses. Okay, so the next section is employment. And so the case manager's role in employment is really to be reviewing those assessments, talking with the person and their guardian or parent about kind of that desired employment outcome to be included in the ISP. And that is for those of working age, and by working age, when we say working age, that is typically 18 to 65. So the case manager is responsible to document that desired employment outcome in conjunction with the path to employment within the ISP, and those paths to employment are outlined in the ISP if you choose the employment goal. I've also listed some resources to help case managers and teams think about the discussion that takes place around employment and how to include that, what information to include in the ISP. The case manager would have the role of providing information related to voc rehab services, and also to provide some information regarding benefits management and referring to a benefits specialist if needed, requested, if the person wants or needs to learn more about how to balance their earnings with benefits, then that would be the case manager's role. The CSP's role is really to be completing those educational and vocational assessments as, again, deemed warranted by the team, using those person-centered discovery tools to learn about the person's preferences, skills, and support needs to really promote successful employment, participating in the team meetings, giving feedback and recommendations about what's worked and not worked, or what is working and what's not working regarding the person's employment, helping with those referrals to VR services, benefit specialists, and other resources. So, you know, maybe the person has been assisted to get connected to VR by the case manager, but they might need some assistance to attend those weekly appointments with the counselor. Things like that would be something that the CSP would have a role in. Also implementing those supports to attain that desired employment outcome as identified in the ISP, and sharing that the relevant documentation and data with the case manager. So as that person is making progress in their desired outcome for employment, whether it's to maintain their current job or to just learn more by job shadowing or visiting businesses in the community, the CSP should be sharing those progress notes with the case manager so they can assess whether that's being provided adequately.
This is Emily Johnson. I'm one of the nurses here at the division, and I just wanted to go over a few things related to the medical portion of the case manager and community support provider responsibilities. Starting with the case manager, we have, to obtain a health history upon admission to the case management agency and update as needed. These would be just very brief things such as diagnosis, their long-term medications, any upcoming or future appointments or procedures, as well as kind of a list of immunizations, just to ensure that you can follow through and make sure that these things are being completed in the future. The second thing, ensuring that identified healthcare appointments, medications, and immunizations are completed by the CSP and needs are addressed in a timely manner. This should be documented at least quarterly and discussed annually at the ISP. Here we would really look for, say Susie has a dental appointment coming up here in February. In April, her quarterly is due, and she never went to the dentist. We would really expect to see some conversation at the quarterly about, the supports in place to get her to that dental appointment. The third thing would be to review and discuss the self-administration assessment and document this discussion at least annually in the ISP. Case managers will not be completing the actual assessment on the person, but they will be kind of the driving force to talk about that assessment at the ISP meeting to make sure all the team is in agreement. If that person self-administers and they have a controlled substance, conversation should also occur at the ISP about proper storage of that medication. Just like you and I mean, we can store our medications how we would like, so if someone self-administers, as long as the team agrees, they can kind of be stored however is appropriate for that person. The final thing is to just update the ISP with any long-term medication changes. We wouldn't be looking for any like Tylenols or anything like that, just blood pressure meds, cholesterol meds, things that people are going to be taking on a long-term basis should be updated if there's any changes. On the community support provider side, really there won't be a whole lot of changes. All aspects of the person's medical needs will be supported through the community support provider's nursing department. That would be, medical appointments, updating immunizations, ordering medications, those sort of things. Updates to the person's medical history should be shared in a timely manner to the case managers. They're really going to glean on that nursing department. The case managers will for that information. The third thing will be actually completing that self-administration assessment. This assessment should then again be reviewed at the ISP. And then the final thing is to communicate with any case managers any medication changes. I believe we do have a poll question. So the question is, who completes the annual self-administration assessment and has the responsibility to submit it to the division for SMART review? So it looks like the majority of people chose the community support provider, and this is absolutely correct. So that actual assessment of the person's ability to self-administer will be submitted in whatever capacity the CSP decides to submit information to the division for SMART review. The actual discussion at the ISP will be the responsibility of the case manager to submit. And actually on that ISP agenda, that question is already addressed in one of the however many questions, the required items. So as long as you answer that question on the ISP agenda, there really should be no reason to, forget that part in the ISP. So, thanks, Emily.
Okay. Under discharges and terminations, the case manager is responsible for completing the discharge notice and the discharge summary. That's the DD 751 and the 750. The case manager is responsible for submitting those to the division when a participant is requesting to leave all HCBS services. For example, if a person decides that they're going to move out of state, we only need one discharge and termination to close out all HCBS services, and that would be submitted by the case manager. The case manager would also submit the notice and the summary for any case manager initiated terminations. So this would be if a case management organization, not an individual case manager, the organization as a whole, if they decide that they can no longer provide supports to a participant, then they would complete the termination notice and summary and assist the person to find another case management organization. In the event of a case manager initiated termination, the case management organization would need to provide the person with 30 days notice so that they could find another agency. Julie will talk a little bit more about this with CSP-initiated terminations, but in those cases, the case manager is responsible for helping the participant find another community support provider if the community support provider they're at has issued a termination.
So on the CSP side, really the process, the only time that a CSP would be submitting the notice and summary to the division would be if there is a CSP-initiated termination. So when a CSP feels that they can no longer provide those direct supports to a person, then they would submit the notice and summary to the division, also providing the participant with that 30-day notice in the event that a CSP is terminating services. So the 30 days applies always in that CSP-initiated termination, but the CSP is only submitting those forms to the division in the event of a CSP-initiated termination. I feel like I'm saying the word termination a lot, but okay.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, if someone is completely leaving all HCBS services, it's the case manager who's going to submit the discharge paperwork. We do not need discharge paperwork from both the case manager and the CSP. Okay, so we have one more question. Okay, so it may feel like we're beating a dead horse. When a participant moves out of state, discontinuing all HCBS services, who is responsible for completing the discharge notice and the discharge summary? Boom. Okay, so just to clarify one more time, if a person is discontinuing all services, it's their choice, they're not being terminated, the case manager is the one who will submit the discharge notice and summary. We only need one.
Right, and to elaborate, if you think about separating the case management service and that HCBS funding for that open service of case management separated from HCBS for direct services. So essentially a case management agency could terminate services while the person is still maintains at the CSP, or vice versa. A CSP could terminate and the person maintains their HCBS eligibility with case management only. However, if they're completely leaving HCBS, the case manager is the one who basically kind of pulls that all together and says this person is completely leaving HCBS services. So, so they would be the sole point of contact at that point.
For Spdc admissions and consultations, there is much more detailed information about this in the Spdc transition manual, which is one of the attachments that if we can figure out how people can get those downloaded, or we'll email them, or they're for sure on our DDD website. The case manager is responsible for facilitating team meetings when services are in jeopardy. They will also be the ones to complete SDDC admissions requests if the services that are in jeopardy reach that point where a person might need institutional level of care. The case manager is going to be the one to submit the request for admission with all of the supporting documentation to the division. The community support provider is going to be responsible for attending any team meeting that's being held to discuss if a person's services are in jeopardy. The community support provider will also be the one to complete any SDDC consultation request and all the supporting documentation to the division. And the reason for that is the consultation request really has to do with those day-to-day supports that a person's receiving, and since those are provided by the community support provider, they would be the one to request a consultation. That being said, there still needs to be some sort of team meeting or some sort of involvement by the case manager so that they're aware of what's going on and whatever situations might have come up. One other thing that I wanted to mention here in relation to discharges from SDDC, our office has recently created a transition plan. This takes the place of the separate discharge summary and the temporary plan of care. The transition plan is meant to be a team effort between a community support provider, the case manager, and SDDC to make sure that people have the right supports in place when they transition into the community. That transition plan is available on our website. The transition plan would be started by SDDC and filling out some of the historical information about the person's admission. The case manager would then take over the transition plan and completing any of the documentation that goes with that that the team discusses. That transition plan is then also used for that 30-day period between when a person starts services at a CSP and when the initial ISP is completed. Like I said, there's more detailed information about SDDC admissions, consultations, and discharges in the transition manual, which is should be available on the website. Okay, moving on to SMART. One of the documents that we've put together is an outline of all of the causal factors, elements and causal factors, and whether the case manager or the community support provider is responsible for each of those elements and causal factors. This again was one of the documents that should be available for download. We'll find a way to get it out to you regardless. The elements and causal factors that the case manager is responsible for mostly pertain to things like monitoring and coordination of a person's plan. One of the areas where that is clear is in ISP monitoring. You'll notice that the case manager has a majority of the causal factors that pertain to quarterly monitoring. One other thing that I wanted to point out on this document is the service choice and the provider choice. These are case manager responsibilities. The CSP is not responsible at all for service or provider choice. The case manager should be going over all of the different providers across South Dakota. That's not just all of the case management providers, but all of the service providers across the state. And then the same goes for service choice. The service choice needs to outline all of the different services that are available to a person, not just the services that are available through the case management organization. The service choice and provider choice information is one of the required items on the ISP agenda, and a case manager can document that information there. So that you went over all of the different providers and all of the different services that are available to a person.
And to kind of jump off of what Sam said, the CSP portion of SMART Review will really be heavy on the implementation side of the services and supports outlined in the ISP. What I wanted to point out is that even though, sorry, I have my document backwards here, even though things like service and provider choice notice, those are NA, but then when you get into the service planning, could you scroll down, Sam, a little bit into the service planning part? So as you get into like the adaptive behavior in the ILS, where we typically look at the ICAP, for example, ISP team, ISP annual update, needed revision. Those say NA as far as SMART elements and causal factors go. However, based on the information we just reviewed and talked about with ISP like development and revision, just because there's not a SMART causal factor for that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a role, and we've kind of talked about all of that already. So I just wanted to point that out. Even though it says NA and there's not necessarily something that you might be cited on, there definitely is a role for the CSP in those pieces of the ISP development, revision, etc., in that partnership with completing the ICAP. But mostly what the CSP will be measured and reviewed on within SMART is the implementation of those supports. The last thing that we want to touch on, at the bottom of our roles and responsibilities document, you'll see a couple additional items for clarification. So the first one is that the CSP is expected to follow their policies and procedures as well as the participant's ISP when those medical emergencies and even the non-emergencies occur, and keep that case manager informed through the incident reports or via phone call or email, and that the guardian contact is also should be made by the CSP when those emergencies come up. So we're not seeing case managers maybe in the same role that they have been in the past in their service coordination days as being sort of an on-call, all hours of the night sort of contact to rush to the emergency room. And certainly I'm sure that there are many case managers out there who would be willing to do that, but that's not typically the role that they would play. So we just wanted to clarify that.
We also wanted to clarify about personal outcome measures. There are a number of people who can complete these. CSPs have certified staff, so do case managers. CQL may be coming on site during their visit every 4 years. Division staff, there are also a number of us who are certified who may be coming out to do personal outcome interviews as well. So just keep in mind that there are a number of people who may be completing those. One last thing that I wanted to just reiterate also, again, is that the ISP document is the personal focus worksheet, the ISP agenda, and the form labeled ISP. They are all together what we are considering the individual support plan. So we have advised case managers that information does not need to be repeated between the ISP agenda and the ISP because they're all three documents, the ISP.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I would mention is something that we had talked with case managers about in December during a training session about the ISP, is that for some of those daily supports that happen just on a daily basis for the person or a weekly basis, such as helping with toothbrushing or grocery shopping or just kind of those day-to-day things that staff just do as part of life for the person, will be captured in discussion records. When we had first put the ISP guide together, we didn't note that in the guide. Although we had talked about it, it fell through the cracks. So we did talk with case managers about that. That has been added to the guide. Just wanted to mention that as well. And there's a question about pulling the number 5 question of the personal focus worksheet into the ISP anymore. Is that the question, Bernadette, about what is most important to the person that you would link to that first narrative section?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you wouldn't have to. You can, but what we want to make sure is what we were seeing was a lot of the required items were being pulled forward into the ISP, into the discussion record. So you're seeing literally the same exact information mirrored in 2 spots. Because I think only for a time, and as we've been working through all the kinks in this process, only that ISP document was being shared with teams. And so to make sure that DSPs or folks at the CSP were privy to all the information about personal finances and guardianship and time alone and things like that, it was being relayed into those discussion records. But that's why Sam said we're seeing all 3 of those documents as the ISP in it as a whole, and so not needing to repeat that. There's also a question about how often does the POM, personal outcome measures, interview need to be completed.
One thing I will say about that is that a lot of the POMS questions are tied to the personal focus worksheet, which is updated annually. So it's probably just a good resource to do those POMS interviews. It's a lot of the same information.
Right. I think in the past, and what a lot of CSPs have done in the past, and just to kind of take a cue from them, I think have kind of come up with their own method and frequency for how often, and a lot of that depends on how many people are supported by one particular agency, and kind of what that schedule and spreading those to a manageable level is. So the ARSD says that an outcomes assessment should be completed annually, I believe. But how that looks, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full personal outcome measures interview. It could be, like Sam mentioned, the personal focus worksheet. I think some CSPs in the past have chosen like a few questions to review with the person each quarter. There are a variety of ways that people have met that requirement. So Shanna asks, what part of the ISP agenda should capture PBS, positive behavior supports, and rights restrictions plan to ensure the plan is reviewed and updated during the ISP? I think that if that information is shared during the ISP development stage, I would see that being tied into some of that personal focus worksheet information, which then can be linked to the agenda, Shanna. And that would be another area where the team would really want to make sure that if that's a big part of that person's life, that is communicated really clearly as a need to review and discuss at the ISP, or within that ISP planning process anyway.
The other place that it could be documented is within the ISP itself. There's a risk section that may identify some of those areas as well that are part of a behavior support plan.
LifeQuest has a question about service record, and they would like to just ask over the phone, which is perfectly fine. Away.
Yeah. Hi, Julie. This is Pam. I'm having a hard time composing the question, so I'm just going to ask. All right. In terms of the old service record and filing of significant change requests, okay, on the significant change request, we have to, if you have a change to day services or pre-voc, as we call them now, you have to record the number of hours a person is currently in and the number of hours in which they would change to. So in the future, if we have to change those number of hours and move them around, and if we don't have access to know what they are currently in, how am I going to record that on the change form?
So one way that you could do that, Pam, is the monthly CSA, the Consumer Service Authorization that you get, would have what is current, what you're currently being paid to provide. And in the past, sometimes that's varied a little bit because we had some rule about if it was less than 10 hours, but we've tried to do away with that. So what's on the CSA should be accurate. And so if you can rely on that to record the previous hours, that should work.
Okay, I'm getting that clear in my head now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from the Center for Independence about acknowledging the ISP in TheraP. I will direct you to the ISP guide because there's a series of steps that you have to follow, and I don't actually have the guide directly in front of me. So again, that's available on our website and in the ISP section. It's quite a lengthy document, so I can't tell you what page it's on exactly, but it's in there. Any other questions? I'm sure everything got resolved in this webinar, right? Oh, darn, another one. Okay, sorry, just kidding. Renee says, we're working with therapists we cannot currently acknowledge in the secondary account. Okay, so again, that's one of those kinks that we've been working with TheraP on. So the way it should work is what's outlined in the guide. But we definitely have revised the guide a few times based on what we've learned from those who are actually using it. So Renee, well, if SESDAC is working with TheraP on that, I'm guessing that there will be others who are or will be working with TheraP on the same issue. So if it does not work, once they tell you what's up and running, if it's not working the way that guide outlines, please let us know so we can update that so it's accurate. Amy from Lightscape asks, can you talk about what the expectations are for the sharing of documents from the CSP to the CM provider? So there has been some communication about what needs to be shared. I don't have that specific communication in front of me, but it includes much of the documents that we've outlined in the responsibilities as far as social histories, ICAPs, past quarterly monitoring. I'm looking at Sam also to psychologicals, and I know that there are some issues with releasing information and getting psychological information shared, so we're aware of that. I believe that we gave a deadline of January 31st for that information to be shared in just sort of an effort to create a clear guideline, because we could be going back and forth for a really long time otherwise, trying to track down which information is where and who we expect it to be sent from. So essentially anything that's necessary for the case manager to do their job and to learn about the person would need to be shared. I'm not sure, Amy, if you had something more specific in mind.
I know it was an email that was shared that it came either from Dan or Ann. There was also a document that got shared in that the case management sub-work group. Mm-hmm. There's representation from the case management organizations and the community support providers, so I know information got shared there as well.
Okay, so Amy also says, does the CSP need to send the records to the case manager or just make the file available to the case manager for the case manager to find the records themselves? Well, that sounds like a specific situation that you're probably dealing with, and based on the different subsystems that CSPs are using, I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I guess my answer very vaguely would be it depends on what that availability looks like. I'm not quite sure. And Carla says document storage using the folders named accordingly works great as that sharing tool. And I would agree the document storage in TheraP has been a lifesaver, I'm sure, within the division and I'm sure beyond.
Maybe, this is Katie, maybe you said this, but I have a quick question. Can I ask it?
Sure. I will try to answer.
So if we are sharing the document storage between the case manager and the CSP through TheraP, so we can see theirs and I'm not sure that they can all see ours. And that's under the oversight of the division, so you can see theirs. I mean, is there a way so that we aren't uploading from theirs into ours and like to just have one common storage?
Okay, say that one more time. So the case management account and the secondary account you're saying are within like the division oversight. Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
So you're asking if there can be one central place to store documents?
I'm just not sure that it makes like sense time-wise for anybody to be uploading documentation that the division can see for both sides. So, you know, they're supposed to upload stuff from us into theirs, or, you know, or we're supposed to do that for them. You get what I'm saying? Like, I think that there's just a lot of paper shuffling, and I was wondering if there was a way, if it's under the division oversight account, so the division can see both sides, the CFCM and the case management side of the TheraP system, could we just agree to have it in one of the document storage versus having it in both?
So I think that either I'll direct you to Colin about that, or maybe we can bring that up to Colin during one of our upcoming meetings. I am personally not sure if that's possible, but he's been dealing with TheraP and all the account linking and unifying and oversight and all of those things. So we can check with him, or you can maybe send him an email. Maybe it would be better if you just explain it yourself to him to see if that's possible. The way I'm familiar with TheraP, I don't think so, but there might be something that we can figure out with them.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, that was not probably the answer you were hoping for, but it's all I've got right now. Okay. Well, I think at this point we will wrap up. As we mentioned, the roles and responsibilities document has been distributed for feedback, so if you have thoughts or ideas regarding that, you can email them to Sam and I. I included our email addresses further up in the chat pod. And I appreciate everyone who's participated, and the active participation today is like really rare for a webinar, so that's been nice. We will plan to email the attachments. We mentioned those that are available on our website. Maybe would it make more sense to just make sure that they're on the website and updated? So rather than trying to email 121 people that were in attendance today, I think that we'll just make sure that the most updated copies are on our website for download. I apologize that function wasn't working today. But we will make sure that those are posted on our website by the end of the week at the very latest. Thank you very much. Everyone have a great day and stay warm and out of the snow.